Morning, everybody. I'm glad you came. So my brothers and I have two brothers, every decade or so, put together a top 10 list. Do you guys ever do this? We put together our top 10 favorite movies, and I have here the list from 2007. If we can put that up. You can tell that it's 2007 because of the Times New Roman's font, first of all. But if you read down through the list, you will learn two things about me. One is that I am not and never was one of the cool kids. And the second is one of the hotly disputed things or dialogues that happened between my brothers and I as to whether The Lord of the Rings should count as 1 or 3 slots on this list. But if you pressed me on which movie I like the most, it would be The Fellowship of the Ring. And it's not news to anybody in this room if you've been here for more than a month that I'm a big fan of Lord of the Rings. Today, we're going to be looking at a passage from the Bible that would certainly make my top 10 list. And like Lord of the Rings, it's actually sort of like 2 passages, but I'm only counting it as 1. It is toward the very end of the Bible in the book of Revelation, which seems fitting because we started this series in Narnia at the very beginning of the Bible with Genesis 1. So we're having a bookend, if you will. And as the last series, or last segment of this series, it's actually acting as a little bit of a bridge. The next series we're coming into is called Dream. And as we read from the book of Revelation, we will, in a sense, see the dream that God has for the entire universe. But as I'm preparing for this series, I'm reading 2 books. I'm reading from the Bible, the book of Deuteronomy, and if you want to kind of track with us, you can read the book of Deuteronomy as well. It's from the Old Testament, and I'm not sure if the book of Deuteronomy will take us through the entire series, but I think it'll be a good place for us to start because it is the story of God's people just as they are to enter in to the place that they'd been dreaming about going for an entire generation. The other book that I'm reading alongside it is called Bearing the Cross, and it's a biography of Martin Luther King Jr. And if anybody wants this book, you can run up and take it. Whoever gets here first can have it. All right. I got it on Kindle. I bought it with some credit, so I don't need that copy anymore. But it's a Pulitzer Prize winning book. I should have said that before. Maybe there would have been more demand. But you should know that your relationship with God works a little bit like that. If you want it, you can have it. And you don't even have to be first. So with that, and before we get to Revelation, I'm going to invite up Linda Cernick. There's a picture of her and her 3 strapping boys and husband up on the screen. Some of you may know Linda as the mom of the family that's tall with all boys. But as you can see, one of them just graduated from high school, and Linda started reading to the youngest, Jonah, out of the Chronicles of Narnia at the beginning of our series out loud in his bedroom. And what happened is that her sons and husband too, right, came in and started listening to those stories. And after a few minutes, Micah, the middle child, would fall asleep, as I'm told. And Micah, you're in good company because the same thing would happen to Allison when I would read to her. But anyway, I want to celebrate that because I see just the incredible value of families coming together and sharing stories, because as we've been saying this entire series, like, stories are so powerful in shaping who we are. And they're great windows into the soul. So Linda is going to be reading from the book called The Last Battle. And this is C.S. Lewis's picture, allegory of the end of Narnia and as it relates to the end of our world. What you need to know, I guess, is that everybody's dead. Everybody passed through the door from this life into the next. So the picture that C.S. Lewis is painting is one of being in Aslan's country. Aslan, the Jesus figure in this book, a lion as he is, if I can use the word incarnate in the entire series, the one that everybody's always waiting for, longing for, and whose their hearts just fill up at the sight of him. So let's read now from The Last Battle.
Tyrion had thought, or he would have thought if he had time to think at all, but they were inside a little thatched stable, about 12 feet long and 6 feet wide. In reality, they stood on grass. The deep blue sky was overhead, and the air which blew gently on their faces was that of a day in early summer. Not far away from them rose a grove of trees, thickly leaved, but under every leaf there peeped out the gold or faint yellow of purple or glowing red of fruits such as no one had seen in our world. The fruit made Tyrion feel that it must be autumn, but there was something in the air, in the feel of the air, that told him it could not be later than June. They all moved toward the trees. Everyone raised his hand to pick the fruit he best liked the look of, and then everyone paused for a second. This fruit was so beautiful that each felt, it can't be for me. Surely we're not allowed to pluck it. It's all right, said Peter. I know what we're all thinking, but I'm quite sure we needn't. I have a feeling we've got to the country where everything is allowed. Here goes then, said Eustace, and they all began to eat. What was the fruit like? Unfortunately, no one can describe a taste. All I can say is that, compared with those fruits, the freshest grapefruit you've ever eaten was dull, and the juiciest orange was dry, and the most melting pear was hard and woody, and the sweetest wild strawberry was sour. And there were no seeds or stones and no wasps. If you had once eaten that fruit, all the nicest things in this world would taste like medicines after that. But I can't describe it. You can't find out what it is like unless you get to that country and taste for yourself. And then the group wandered around for the next 2 chapters. And then their friend Farsight the eagle circled round and alighted on the ground. Kings and queens, he cried, we have all been blind. We are only beginning to see where we are. From up there I have seen it all. Ettinsmuir, Beaver's Dam, the great river, and Cair Paravel still shining on the edge of the eastern sea. Narnia is not dead. This is Narnia. But how can it be, said Peter, for Aslan told us older ones that we should never return to Narnia. And here we are. Yes, said Eustace, and we saw it all destroyed and the sun put out. And it's all so different, said Lucy. The eagle is right, said the Lord Diggory. Listen, Peter. When Aslan said you could never go back to Narnia, he meant the Narnia you were thinking of, but that was not the real Narnia. That had a beginning and an end. It was only a shadow or a copy of the real Narnia, which has always been here and always will be here, just as our own world, England and all, is only a shadow or a copy of something in Aslan's real world. You need not mourn over Narnia, Lucy. All of the old Narnia that mattered, all the dear creatures have been drawn into the real Narnia through that door. And of course it is different as a real thing is from a shadow, or as a waking life is from a dream. It is hard to explain how this sunlit land was different from the old Narnia, as it would be to tell you how the fruits of that country taste. Perhaps you will get some idea of it if you think like this. You may have been in a room in which there was a window that looked out on a lovely bay of the sea or a green valley that wound away among the mountains. And in the wall of that room, opposite to the window, there may have been a looking glass. And as you turned away from the window, you suddenly caught sight of that sea or of that valley all over again in the looking glass. And the sea in the mirror, or the valley in the mirror, were in one sense just the same as the real ones, yet at the same time, they were somehow different, deeper, more wonderful, more like places in a story you have never heard, but very much want to know. The difference between the old Narnia and the new Narnia was like that. The new one was a deeper country. Every rock and flower and blade of grass looked as if it meant more. I can't describe it any better than that. If you ever get there, you will know what I mean. It was the unicorn who summed up what everyone was feeling. He stamped his right forehoof on the ground and neighed and then cried, I have come home at last. This is my real country. I belong here. This is the land I have been looking for all my life, though I never knew it till now. The reason why we loved the old Narnia is that it sometimes looked a little like this. Bree, come up further. Come further up, come further in.
And now, thank you, Linda. This is a picture of our real home in the future as a man named John had it revealed to him. He said, I saw a vast crowd, too great to count, from every nation and tribe and people and language, standing in front of the throne and before the Lamb, which is Jesus here, unlike Aslan, who's a lion. They were clothed in white robes, and they held palm branches in their hands. And they were shouting with a great roar, salvation comes from our God who sits on the throne and from the Lamb. This is Revelation 21. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the old heaven and the old earth had disappeared, and the sea was also gone. And I saw the holy city, the New Jerusalem, coming down from God out of heaven like a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. I heard a loud shout from the throne, saying, Look, God's home is now among his people. He will live with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them. He will wipe every tear from their eyes, and there will be no more death or sorrow or crying or pain. All these things are gone forever. And the one sitting on the throne said, Look, I am making everything new. And then he said to me, Write this down, for what I tell you is trustworthy and true. And he also said, It is finished. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To all who are thirsty, I will give freely from the springs of the water of life. All who are victorious will inherit all these blessings, and I will be their God, and they will be my children. This is a beautiful picture for us. It is the hope that we have. It is what waits for us after death if we turn toward God. If we want relationship with God, we can have it, we can have him, and we can have this. But let me import this, or let me try to help you understand why this hope is so important for you now. In the years leading up to the civil rights movement, there was a man who Martin Luther King considered a mentor. His name was Howard Thurman. And he was responding to one of the charges against African American spiritual songs that was coming against them in academic circles. He himself was a college professor, and he goes to Harvard, and he gives a lecture. He says, you say that because the songs were so focused on the next life, they were so quote-unquote otherworldly, you think that slaves became docile and accepted the plight that they were in, the persecution, the slavery that they were trapped in. But he said, on the contrary, next slide, please. The facts make clear that this sung faith did serve to deepen the capacity of the slaves' endurance and the absorption of suffering. It taught a people how to ride high in life, to look squarely in the face of those facts that argue most dramatically against all hope, and to use those facts as raw material out of which they fashioned a hope that the environment, with all of its cruelty, could not crush. This enabled them to reject annihilation and to affirm the terrible right to live. Now, none of us will endure or suffer the way that slaves did in this country during the 17 and 1800s. But we need hope. We need hope to survive this world. The opposite of hope, despair, is a bad place to go. And when you feel ultimate despair, you will find your thirst for life dried up. And while none of you are suffering just as the slaves did, I know that many of you came in today. I don't know all of your stories, but I know enough of them to know that many of you came in today ready to wave your white flag of surrender. You're hanging on to life by a thread. The facts are too big, too scary, too heavy for you to carry. And for some of you, it's not necessarily showing itself on the outside or on the front of your mind, but it's just below the surface. If you were put into a room and if you were asked, how are you doing? How are you really doing? And if you were given a moment to be honest about the reality, your reality that you're facing, the tears would begin. You're holding on by a thread. You need hope, real hope. And I don't mean about the false hope that tomorrow will be better than today. Because let's be honest, tomorrow will probably not be better than today. I know this because tomorrow is Monday. And today after church, there's free food and there's moon bounces for the kids. So they're going to just have a great time and you're going to be able to eat and listen to live music. Tomorrow's probably not going to be better than today. We need to stand on a true hope, the kind of hope that the slaves clung to make it not just to survive, to look death in the face and say, no, I do not fear death and life is worth living. It's the hope of Revelation 21. It's the hope that God promises us. And so let's just walk through Revelation 21. I know that I allude to Revelation 21 quite a bit. You've probably heard it even in the last month. But I want to walk through it in a little more intentionality today. So it begins by saying, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the old heaven and the old earth had disappeared, and the sea was also gone." And I want to just spend a moment on that metaphor of the sea, because for the Jewish people in the Jewish mind, the sea was representative of chaos. It was something they couldn't control, and as much as possible, they stayed away from it. Sailing out into the Mediterranean Sea, in the mind of like the Jews or the Israelites of the Old Testament, would have meant certain death. And even on the Sea of Galilee, which was more of a lake, they would stay as close to the coast as they possibly could. So this idea of chaos disappearing, being conquered once and for all, has some teeth to it. And there's chaos in your life as well, chaos that you cannot contain or control. Some of it is external, and some of it is internal. I know somebody, you don't try to guess who it is. It's not like anybody sitting here, who was sitting with their spiritual director, and he was sharing about the cycle that he and his wife were in, and I'm sure that it's like a familiar cycle for many of you. And it was the cycle of shame and blame, right? He felt shame, and then he turned toward blaming his wife for the thing that he felt shame about. And the spiritual director says, you should really read this book. And then the spiritual director kind of pauses. He says, I feel like I'm going through deja vu. And the guy sitting there, he says to me, he's like, and I realized that this book had been recommended to me by him a year ago, and that I was in this cycle. He thought, oh crap, is there any hope for me? And I say to the guy, no, realizing that you're in the cycle is actually a great sign. And I believe that, yes, there is hope, because there's hope for every marriage in this room. There's hope for every person in this room. And the ultimate hope is that in the new heavens and the new earth, there will be no longer any sea. The chaos will be taken care of. So I'm wondering if any of you know what this is. This, as Abigail said, is a nose Frida. I've used this a lot this week. So the way, I don't know if you know this or not, but babies can't blow their nose on their own. So what you do is you put this side in your mouth, you put this side in their nose, and you suck. But there's a filter there that keeps the snot from going into your mouth. Anyway, remember this. There is chaos in your life that you cannot contain. And snot is actually such a great metaphor for it, because it makes you miserable, and it makes other people miserable too if you spread it all into their business, But God will come, and He will bring an end to all the snot in your life. In the new heavens and the new earth, there will no longer be any sea. Okay, so you'll remember this, right? Nose Frida. It's a great I would like one for myself. I can't share it with the baby, I guess. I don't know. I have a cough drop. I'm doing all right. Okay. Verse 2. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down from God out of heaven like a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. This is a picture of heaven crashing into earth. This is our ultimate future. This is different than maybe what you were raised with in the church, because our modern church views heaven as a place that we will escape earth to go to when we die. And there's if you're really interested in all the details of this, N.T. Wright has 2 great books, Simply Christian and Surprised by Hope, and you can get into it. I'm not going to get into it. But the picture here is not of escaping to go to heaven for all of eternity. The picture here is that heaven crashes into earth for all of eternity, much like what happens with the new Narnia in the last battle. And I think this is good news for us, because I remember as a teenager how spending eternity with harps and halos in the clouds didn't sound all that great. If it sounds great to you, you're a more spiritual person than I am, I suppose. But the good news here is that the things you love most about life, you'll be able to enjoy in the new heavens and the new earth. It's like the fruit that was eaten in Aslan's country. It made the sweetest strawberry taste sour. I actually, in the last 2 weeks, I had the most enjoyable cup of coffee that I've ever had. I don't know if you noticed, our new drummer, he and his wife, Caleb and Ashley, moved here from Florida, I think. Florida, yeah. You've been kind of around that. They're Southerners. They're down in that little southern loop. And we had a baby daddy date, sort of, Caleb and I. And he brewed me a cup of coffee, and I thought, I didn't know coffee could taste like this. What do you call it? It's Chemex. I have never heard of that. Maybe some of you have. But it's a new way to make coffee, and man, was it good. And if you love coffee, the coffee in heaven is going to make that coffee taste like Folgers. If you like Folgers, your Folgers will taste like, it'll make Folgers taste like dirt or something like that. No, not some people, to each their own. I'm not judging. I'm trying to create a non-judgmental space here Sunday morning. Some of you love wine. I think the best wine I've ever drank, and part of this was context, was a St. Francis Cabernet, and we were in Sonoma Valley drinking it. And it tasted like tobacco and cedar. And the wine in heaven will make that taste like Barefoot. The $7 bottle from Barefoot's not really that bad. We drink a lot of it at our house. Yeah, some of you drank it recently too. It's a good value wine. Anyway, there's a level at which the things we get to enjoy are going to be even better. The mountains will be crisper, the blues will be bluer, the grass will be greener. This is the hope that we're being given, and it's a hope that has teeth for today because it gives you something to hang on to when the chaos comes, when the sea swells, when the waves come up over your head, when you realize that you can't hold all of life together, when you've come to your end. That the true end is a beautiful picture, and it's with God. And if you want relationship with God, you can have it. But it actually gets better than that. He says, I heard a loud shout from the throne saying, look, God's home is now among his people. He will live with them, and they will be his people. God himself will be with them. God wants to be with us. And when he comes, here's what happens. He will wipe every tear from their eyes, and there will be no more death or sorrow or crying or pain. All these things, bad things, are gone forever, right? And the one sitting on the throne said, "Look, I am making everything new." And then he said to me, "Write this down, for what I tell you is trustworthy and true." So, when God comes, he dwells with his people. And I want you to remember what God's people looks like. Every tribe and nation and people coming together. I read that before. God's invitation is wider than you can imagine. And we get little tastes of it here on earth. Just like you taste a good wine, it's actually pointing you toward the wine of the new heavens and the new earth. You look around this room, and we're a work in progress, but you see people who have different ethnic backgrounds. You see people from India and who are African American, and from the Pacific Islands, and from Latin America, mixed in with, the white European. And we're just getting a little taste of it, right? And we have a ways to go. We're going to celebrate it as much as we can. We have a ways to go before the new heavens and the new earth come. And that comes with its beauty, and sometimes with a little bit of uncomfortability. Because it's not just all the ethnicities, it's all the social classes, and it's rich and it's poor. And I bring this up a lot because it's so stark. I look at the room and I see the Democrats and I see the Republicans and I see the independents, and some of you don't vote, and God invites you all. And we get a little taste of what it's like to live in this beautiful diversity here in this church. And it's going to be more beautiful in the next life. And with that diversity, when this diversity comes together, there's going to be tears sometimes because of the pain that has been inflicted on each other. And it says here that God comes and he wipes away the tears. And that's just one little component of what the new heavens and the new earth looks like. But we're reminded, again, at the beginning of this passage, heaven crashes into earth. So while God comes and makes things perfect or new, we make investments in this life, in this time, in this place to help model, to show people what the new heavens and earth look like as much as we can. N.T. Wright, who I mentioned earlier, he calls us people of the future. He says Christians are people of the future because they're always trying to draw as much as they can the future into the present. And I think about all the other reasons that the tears might come. Because you're mourning the loss of a loved one, because you lost your job, because you're dealing with heartbreak, because you're fighting with your spouse, because your kid doesn't want to talk to you. I can't even begin to imagine what that would feel like. And it says God comes and he wipes away every tear. And I think, what does it mean to be people of the future? What does it mean to sit with people and wipe away their tears? To listen and to understand and to show them the kind of love that God has for them. And he also said, "It is finished. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To all who are thirsty, I will give freely from the springs of the water of life. All who are victorious will inherit all these blessings, and I will be their God, and they will be my children." I think it's interesting, or I noticed as I was looking at this passage this week, that I think God is speaking. I don't know who's speaking. It's a loud voice that comes from the throne, probably God. And he talks about all those who thirst for me. And it's actually pretty common in the Bible to use the words hunger and thirst for desire. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, which is that's part of what God's kingdom, the new heaven and earth brings, right? Is justice. But it's interesting that here he only uses the word thirst. And I think thirst is especially acute. Thirst is desperation at some level. So maybe you know this. You know you can survive 3 weeks without food? You'd be hungry. I get hungry after about 3 hours without food. But you would survive. You know how long you can survive without water? 3 days. A thirst for the water that God offers you is like a desperate desire to have your needs that are at the very bottom of your heart met by the only one who can truly meet them. This happened to Martin Luther King, actually, after he graduated from seminary, after he got his doctorate, after he was installed as a pastor, after he became the face of the Montgomery bus boycott. It happened, his thirst for God came after he started receiving threats on his life and to his family. His faith up to that point, he'd gone to church his whole life. His daddy was a preacher. His grandpa was a preacher. He was a preacher. I bet you he went to church 5 times a week. But he hadn't felt the thirst, and he hadn't gone to God for the living water until he realized that the world's trouble was bigger than he could tackle. And he says this, these are his own words. This is at midnight. He says, "Lord, I must confess that I am weak now. I'm faltering. I'm losing my courage." And then it happened. And it seemed that at that moment that I could hear an inner voice saying to me, "Martin Luther, stand up for righteousness, stand up for justice, stand up for truth, and lo, I will be with you even to the end of the world." It is in that moment of thirst that God's voice came to him. It is in that moment of thirst that for Martin Luther King, his faith became real. And you know the rest of the story. It was this trust or this awakening that came through this personal inner voice that pointed him to the hope, the reality that God is with us and will be with us, lo, to the end of the age and into eternity. And so as we conclude here, I ask you, are you thirsty? Have you tried to put a wall in your heart to ward off the sea? Have you put on a mask even this morning to say, "I'm okay, I'm fine, I'm holding it together, I can deal with my own problems, I don't need help"? Or are you ready to say, "No, apart from God, I'm thirsty and I'm going to die"? So why don't you stand with me? And I'm going to invite God to actually come into the room in a way that you can feel it. So if you would close your eyes. Holy Spirit, come. We ask that your presence would be felt today by people who are thirsty. And in this moment, if there are people who say, "I was thirsty once, I've become numb, I want to be thirsty again," God, I ask actually that you would increase their thirst or make them aware again of how much they need you. So God, give us a taste of heaven this morning. We thank you for the hope that you give us and also for the love that you offer each one of us if we would just turn to you and say, "Help, I need you." Amen.